Thank you for joining us for Mini-Bite 3 of BC's Office of the Human Rights Commissioner's web-based learning sessions on misinformation. This session answers the question, why is misinformation a human rights issue? If you haven't watched Mini-Bites 1 and 2, we encourage you to do so. Mini-Bite 1 provides an introduction to BC's Office of the Human Rights Commissioner, offers an overview of all 5 mini-bites, and explains how to use the different components of these web-based learning sessions. And Mini-Bite 2 considers how misinformation works. In Mini-Bite 3, we will explore why misinformation is a human rights issue. During this session, we will ask you to pause and reflect. So consider pausing this recording and downloading the handouts package, which is located beside this mini-bite in our Misinformation Can You Stop It webpage. You can record your reflections in the fillable forms in these handouts. Or you may prefer to have a pen and paper available to write down your thoughts. In Mini-Bite 3, we will explore why misinformation is a human rights issue, and consider examples of how misinformation impacts human rights and democracy. To avoid potential harms caused by misinformation that impacts human rights, we have chosen not to share specific examples of actual posts with this type of misinformation. Instead, we will share general examples of the impacts that this misinformation causes. This may bring up memories of harms that you or someone you care about has experienced. Please do what you need to do to take care of yourself during this session. This may include pausing the recording until you feel ready to continue.
Before considering the impacts of misinformation on human rights that our office has identified, take a minute to reflect on the following questions. Why is misinformation a human rights issue? How does it harm you and those you care about? How does it harm specific groups of people? And how does it harm all of society? Handout 1 is a fillable form where you can record your reflections throughout this session. You may wish to pause the recording to download the handouts package and record your reflections. The handouts package appears beside this mini-bite on our Misinformation Can You Stop It webpage. At our Misinformation Can You Stop It campaign launch, BC's Human Rights Commissioner Kesari Govender spoke about how misinformation impacts human rights. We also asked members of the public similar questions. This video includes some of their responses to these questions.
I feel that the biggest risk of being so much misinformation out there is it can ruin somebody's life. We don't know for sure that all the information that we come across on the internet is true. So if somebody says something about another person and it's a lie, and suddenly everybody's saying the same thing, as I mentioned before, it somehow becomes true. And this could cost somebody's career, this could cost somebody's reputation, this could cost somebody's life entirely. And as somebody that supports a person that has been through that, I feel that it's really dangerous. And we have to think before we spread this information. We have to think before we agree with somebody else just because they said something that everybody's saying.
Especially with so much content out there right now, we see YouTube channels with AI-generated videos that tell stories of our past that are not being fact-checked. So in a way, all of these information are reshaping the way we're seeing history and hence how we envision our future.
I am an international student from Japan. In Japan, we don't have any same-sex marriage equality. Sometimes I've experienced the misinformation from the online nationalists. They criticize the people who are gay, queers, people, folks, and I sometimes have so depressed when I saw that post by them. So the mentally injured or something, the kind of the misinformation. So it's one of the biggest issues.
Mis and disinformation is a human rights issue because it often perpetuates stereotypes. It perpetuates conspiracy theories which blame somebody else for the ills of our society or what's maybe wrong in our lives. It foments hate. It creates this us and them kind of dynamics that feeds hate and discrimination in our province. And as terrible as that sounds, it also happens in ways that we often can't even see.
Our office has identified 5 key themes that describe how misinformation impacts our human rights. Many of these themes reflect the examples shared in the video. Misinformation can promote divisiveness and polarization, strengthen prejudices, biases, and stereotypes, lead to the development and spread of conspiracy theories, provoke discrimination and hate, limit our ability to make informed choices, and finally, misinformation can harm democracy. We will explore each of these themes during the rest of this session.
Misinformation contributes to polarization in society. It deepens divisions and turns groups of people against each other. Many of us are currently experiencing serious challenges. These include rising costs for everyday items we need to survive, and limited access to affordable housing. When disinformation divides us, it becomes more difficult to work together to address these challenges. In Mini Bite 1, we discussed how our brains work by accepting information that resembles our existing beliefs and rejecting information that does not correspond to these beliefs. And in Mini Bite 2, we explored how creators of disinformation can take advantage of this by sending us disinformation that builds on our existing values and fears and provokes strong emotions that make us want to act. These disinformation strategies contribute to polarization within our society by widening the gap between groups with different values, turning these groups against each other, and deepening divisions. Misinformation often benefits from periods of crisis to deepen polarization. It deepens divisions by targeting groups on one side of a given issue with misinformation that amplifies their values and beliefs and discredits the values and beliefs of other groups. And it can lead people with shared values and fears to more extreme content. Groups on both sides of any given issue can be targeted by polarizing disinformation, including those with conservative values and those with progressive values. It does this to meet the specific goals of the creators of that piece of disinformation. And these goals are often not at all related to the actual crisis. Let's take a minute to reflect. Can you think of an issue in which polarization has divided our society? And how did misinformation contribute to this polarization? You may wish to pause this recording while you reflect. You can record your reflections in Handout 1, Question 2. And you may not identify an example at this time. As we explore additional ways that misinformation impacts human rights, we'll also consider the role that polarization plays.
Another way that misinformation impacts human rights is by contributing to the spread of conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories place the blame for serious, often tragic issues on a group of people with no evidence that the group blamed is actually responsible. Groups blamed by conspiracy theories become dehumanized and vilified and often become victims of hate and violence. When we experience serious challenges or threats to our safety, it's a natural response for many of us to try and identify the cause of that problem so that we can feel in control and develop strategies to address it. When the source of a problem is complex, or if we haven't identified a source, we may look for someone to blame. And this is especially true in times of crisis. Creators of disinformation often benefit from this common response to a crisis or safety threat by developing disinformation that places the blame for an issue on a specific group. This is known as scapegoating. The goals of the creators of this type of disinformation can include targeting a specific group who they seek to discredit or harm, or shifting our attention away from the real source of a problem, which they may be contributing to. This type of misinformation not only harms the targeted group, but it also prevents us from focusing on and addressing the real source of the problem. We'll explore this impact with an example of misinformation. But before we do, we'd like to provide a content advisory. We will be exploring an example of misinformation that targets people of Asian descent. An example of a crisis which contributed to the spread of conspiracy theories is the COVID-19 pandemic. At the onset of the pandemic, many of us were frightened and overwhelmed by the fast spread of this illness and the large number of deaths, particularly in senior care homes. The fear for our safety led many people to try and identify the source of the pandemic. As the first identified cases were identified in the city of Wuhan in China, some people speculated that the virus may have been transmitted to humans through infected bats sold at markets in the city. Others speculated that the virus was created and accidentally released from a laboratory in Wuhan. This led to the development of several conspiracy theories, blaming China as the source of the COVID virus and people of Chinese origin for its spread around the globe. Misinformation promoting this conspiracy theory spread quickly in our province. A 2020 poll found that 1 in 4 BC residents believed that COVID-19 was engineered as a bioweapon in a Chinese lab. In 2025, the World Health Organization determined that the original source of the virus has not been identified, although most evidence indicates that it came from an animal. Conspiracy theories about specific groups being the source of serious illness are not new. Historically, Asian, Indigenous, and Jewish people have been incorrectly identified as the sources of diseases. These conspiracy theories are based on long-standing and unfounded negative stereotypes about the cleanliness of these groups. We'll explore the human rights impacts of this conspiracy theory in a few minutes. You can find the links to the source of this example and other examples shared in this mini-bite in Handout 2.
Misinformation also impacts human rights by reinforcing existing prejudices and contributing to the spread of biases and stereotypes against marginalized groups. Some examples of these biases and stereotypes that are incorrect and harmful include the classist idea that people experiencing poverty have a poor work ethic, the racist idea that Black and Indigenous people are more likely to commit crimes, and the ableist idea that people with disabilities are less capable of carrying out basic employment tasks. Unconscious bias is a naturally evolved process that our brains use to keep us safe. It can be defined as subconscious, negative perceptions that we hold against groups of people based on their personal characteristics, such as race, gender, or sexuality. These can exist in our minds regardless of our intent, goals, or even what we know to be true. Unconscious bias causes us to automatically respond to unfamiliar people and unfamiliar things with distrust and even fear. It takes a conscious effort to recognize the unconscious biases we hold and work to eliminate them. In addition, our brains tend to place things in groups so that we can remember them more easily. And to create a sense of belonging, we rely on bias and stereotypes to create and reinforce understandings that place people into two groups, those who are like us and those who are different from us. This grouping can lead us to develop stereotypes around specific groups. Stereotypes about physical characteristics, attitudes, and behaviors may be based on our experience with one member of that group. They also may be based on what other sources have told us about them. And if we hold negative biases against a group, these stereotypes are also negative. In Mini-Bite 2, we discussed how creators of disinformation can mislead us by modifying the context or placing the blame for an issue on a group or an event that is unrelated, and by building on our values and fears. These strategies can build on our existing prejudices, biases, and stereotypes, and they may lead us to believe that specific groups are a threat to us. In these ways, misinformation can support the development and spread of harmful attitudes and behaviors towards specific groups. Some consequences of these harmful attitudes and behaviors include discrimination, hate crimes, and radicalization. We'll explore examples of each of these types of harm in the following slides. But before we do, we'd like to provide a content advisory. Over the next few slides, we will explore examples of misinformation that target people who identify as LGBTQ2SAI+, as well as people of Asian ancestry and women. Under BC's Human Rights Code, discrimination is defined as harm that is experienced by a group or groups based on their protected personal characteristic or part of their identity. Examples of protected characteristics include sexual orientation and gender identity. Discrimination can include creating barriers to participation, causing harms, and increasing disadvantages that are already experienced by a marginalized group. Over the past several years, there has been an increase in misinformation targeting people who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer and questioning, two-spirit, asexual, and intersex, also called LGBTQ2SAI+ people. This is particularly the case for trans people. This misinformation builds on people's values, fears, biases, and stereotypes. In Mini-Bite 2, we considered misinformation about the SOGI 123 resource. Misinformation about SOGI 123 is one of many examples of misinformation targeting people who identify as LGBTQ2SAI+, as well as those trying to support them. Misinformation about SOGI 123 builds on biases and stereotypes and contributes to discrimination. As discussed in Mini-Bite 2, the goal of SOGI 123 materials is to help teachers make schools safer, more welcoming, respectful, and inclusive for LGBTQ2SAI+ students and families. But misinformation about SOGI 123 resources present it as a threat to the safety of children. Preventing access to SOGI 123 materials contributes to negative biases and stereotypes against LGBTQ2SAI+ students, which can lead to harmful comments and behaviors. And it limits these students' understanding of their right to equality, as well as their awareness of supports the school can offer them. For example, 62% of LGBTQ2SAI+ students feel unsafe at school, compared to 11% of heterosexual students who identify with the gender they were assigned at birth, also known as cisgender. Links to more information are available in Handout 2. In this video, Commissioner Kasari-Govender further describes how misinformation contributes to discrimination against this group of people.
There's a question from the audience about what role mis and disinformation play in shaping people's perspectives on kids and discussions around gender diversity in our schools and communities. And it's a question that is close to our hearts here at BC's Office of the Human Rights Commissioner, because we're about to launch a big public campaign on addressing mis and disinformation. And it was key to a piece of work that was key to a big inquiry we did about the rise of hate during COVID or during times of crisis in society. But it also reminds me of the anti-SOGI protests that happened across Canada. So for those who may not be familiar with the term, SOGI is sexual orientation and gender identity. And there's curriculum, what people call curriculum. It's really just some school system-based materials that are in our public schools here in British Columbia, optional for teachers to use. It's a tool to talk about to counter bullying, to talk about inclusion and acceptance. And there were protests to having any of those materials in schools across the country. I think it was almost 2 years ago now. And there were significant counter protests. So that was the good news of the story. But one of the pieces that I found heartbreaking, there was so much about it that was heartbreaking, but one of them was how much mis and disinformation there was about these materials and how that was used to garner support from folks maybe who had religious affiliations or felt strongly. And honestly, all of us would have felt strongly if we believed this information too, which was, there's pedophiles in our schools. Your children are being groomed. They're being sexually assaulted. They're being shown pornography in class. As parents, of course, you would not want that to happen to your children. But what we're actually talking about were materials that were aimed at inclusion and acceptance and dismantling bullying in schools. It's a huge divide here in terms of mis and disinformation.
Stereotypes and biases can also contribute to hate crimes. Hate crimes are based on one or more of the victim's personal characteristics. One form of hate crimes is hate speech, which is speech that is expressed publicly, targets a person or group of people with a protected characteristics, such as race, religion, or sexual orientation, and uses extreme language to express hatred towards that person or group of people because of their protected characteristic. Hate speech describes the targeted group in a way that is likely to expose them to detestation and vilification. Misinformation can contribute to an increase in hate incidents and crimes in particular. Earlier, we discussed how misinformation contributed to the spread of the conspiracy theory that the COVID-19 virus was produced in a Chinese lab. Following the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, BC's Office of the Human Rights Commissioner conducted an inquiry into the rise in hate in the COVID pandemic. This inquiry investigated the rise in hate incidents directed at different groups, including anti-Asian hate. The inquiry demonstrated the role this conspiracy theory played in increasing incidents of anti-Asian hate. Here are some examples. 58% of respondents to the hate inquiry survey reported that blame for the COVID pandemic was a factor in the hate incident that they experienced. This included 89% of the survey respondents of East Asian ancestry. And here's an example of the hate experienced by one person of Asian descent. Here's what they had to say. An older Caucasian lady started yelling at us about bringing the virus here and told us to get off the streets. She then coughed in my child's face. My 7-year-old is confused and doesn't understand how we had anything to do with the virus. Misinformation also contributes to radicalization. Radicalization is the development of extreme political, social, or religious views that are in opposition to those that are generally accepted in a society. When these views target specific groups based on their identity, radicalization can lead to increased acts of discrimination, hate, and violence. In BC's Office of the Human Rights Commissioner's inquiry into hate in the pandemic, radicalization into far-right extremism was identified as a source of the spread of hate in our province. And internet and social media were identified as a primary source of radicalization. One anti-radicalization group working with radicalized youth identified that 90% of the youth they worked with were recruited online by far-right extremist groups. Creators of disinformation aimed at radicalizing often target people experiencing social, emotional, and economic challenges. Joining a group promoted by radicalization can provide a sense of belonging in a shared community with a common goal. Disinformation aimed at radicalization builds on existing biases and stereotypes and places the blame for the community's challenges on a specific group or groups. We'll explore the impacts by considering a specific example. Radicalization by extremist groups promoting hatred of women is on the rise. A research study created TikTok accounts to search for topics like masculinity and loneliness. It found that misogynistic content, or content hateful of women, made up 13% of recommendations on the first day and 56% later that week. Disinformation with the goal of white supremacist radicalization is very common online. A former white supremacist told us, "When I was recruiting, the internet had only sort of just come out, but it took months, if not years, to radicalize a person. But with technology and social media now, people can radicalize in a weekend." Let's take a minute to reflect. Can you identify prejudices, stereotypes, and biases that have contributed to conspiracy theories, discrimination, hate crimes, and radicalization in our province? What role did misinformation play? You may wish to pause this recording while you reflect. You can record your reflections in Handout 1, Question 3.
Misinformation also impacts our human rights by limiting our ability to make informed choices. We rely on information to make informed decisions in all aspects of our lives. Some of these decisions impact our ability to have our human rights met. Some examples of these rights include the right to the highest attainable standard of health, the right to housing, and the right to vote. To make informed decisions, we need access to information that's true. By undermining our shared sense of truth, misinformation makes it increasingly difficult to ensure that the information we are basing our decisions on is indeed true. In Minibite 2, we discussed how creators of disinformation are becoming increasingly successful at sending us disinformation that looks real. We also considered how creators of disinformation can bombard us with information, emotional content, or design elements that can overwhelm us. These strategies make it difficult to find the time to identify which information is true. And feeling overwhelmed by misinformation contributes to our mistrust of all information we receive, including the information that we need to make informed decisions. Decisions based on misinformation have varying impacts, from minor to serious. And they may prevent us from protecting ourselves and those we care about. We'll take a few minutes to consider how misinformation limits our ability to make informed decisions by undermining our shared sense of truth and excluding important voices. But first, we'd like to provide a content advisory. The following examples highlight how misinformation harms the human rights of trans and non-binary people and Indigenous peoples. One way that misinformation undermines our shared sense of truth is by minimizing the distinction between opinion and fact. Opinions are subjective, which means that they can differ from one person to another. Opinions are based on our values, experiences, and how we understand the world around us. A fact is something that is true and real. Facts are backed up by evidence proving that they are true. But misinformation often takes advantage of the growing belief that opinions are as valid as facts in all matters, in order to misrepresent opinions as the truth. Misinformation also builds on an unfounded notion of quote-unquote free speech. Freedom of expression is a constitutional right in Canada. But, like all constitutional rights, freedom of expression is subject to reasonable limits. Hate speech and discriminatory speech in certain contexts, such as employment, are prohibited because the government has decided that these laws are reasonable limits on freedom of expression. The Supreme Court of Canada has found that laws that prohibit hate speech are reasonable and justified because hate speech can desensitize people to the effects it has on targeted groups, making it easier to deny these groups equal rights. By taking advantage of these misinterpretations of free speech, truth, and opinion, creators of disinformation undermine the shared understanding of truth. Misinformation also limits our ability to make informed decisions by excluding important voices that could contribute to the decisions that we make. One of the ways that misinformation does this is by pushing out the voices of marginalized and impacted groups. The way it accomplishes this is by discrimination or hate, including threats of violence. As a result, some choose to avoid or reduce participation altogether. For example, a survey of trans and non-binary people found that 62% avoided 3 or more types of public spaces for fear of harassment. BC OHRC's Rights in Focus report provides another example. Indigenous laws and government have built-in expertise on climate adaptation. Through generations of experience, Indigenous peoples have important expertise to share on best practices to adapt to global warming. But when disinformation contributes to anti-Indigenous discrimination and hate, many Indigenous voices are silenced. This limits our access to the expertise they can share, and it limits everyone's access to valuable information that may influence the choices we make. And finally, misinformation can lead to distrust in important sources of information. These sources include mainstream media, scientists, and the government. Losing trust in information from these sources can prevent us from accessing vital information that's needed to make informed decisions. A Statistics Canada survey series on people in their communities found that in 2023, over 2 in 5 Canadians typically got their news or information from social media accounts that were not connected with the government, scientific, or news organizations. When we seek information from unverified sources on social media, we risk basing important decisions on unreliable information. We'll explore this further in Mini-Bite 4. Let's consider an example of how misinformation limits our ability to make informed choices. In Mini-Bite 2, we considered how misinformation about risks with the COVID vaccine targeted social media feeds of people with the shared value of accessing safe healthcare, including alternatives to traditional medicine. Similar disinformation about risks of all types of vaccines has been created and shared. One example is the measles vaccine. Until November 2025, Canada had measles elimination status from the Pan American Health Association. This means that we had prevented the continuous spread of the measles virus for at least 6 months. In Canada, prior to November 2025, we hadn't had a measles outbreak since 1998. But in November 2025, the Public Health Agency of Canada announced that we had lost this status. Between the fall of 2024 and the loss of this status, over 5,000 measles cases were recorded in 9 provinces and 1 territory. One infectious disease expert called this loss of status a giant wake-up call. Misinformation about the safety of vaccines limited our ability to make informed choices about the measles vaccine and led to an increased risk of contracting measles. Measles can have devastating health impacts, particularly on young children, elders, and people with compromised immune systems. Let's take a minute to consider how polarization contributed to this impact. By dividing people who support vaccines and those who don't, misinformation campaigns increase polarization between these two groups. This prevents us from coming together in healthy dialogue, becoming aware of the concerns of each group, and working together towards a common solution. It can also lead to members of each of these groups becoming further separated on unrelated issues when one group is targeted with misinformation on that issue. Let's take a minute to reflect. Can you think of examples of decisions that may have been impacted by undermining our shared sense of truth and excluding important voices? What role did misinformation play? You may wish to pause this recording while you reflect. You can record your reflections and hand out 1 question 4.
A final human rights impact of misinformation is that it harms democracy. In addition to undermining our shared sense of truth, misinformation harms democratic processes in a few ways. These include reducing our trust in government and the organizations that hold them accountable, and limiting the transparency and accountability of democratic societies. Before we explore the different ways misinformation harms democratic processes, we'd like to provide a content advisory. One example of misinformation refers to sexual abuse of children. Another example describes misinformation that impacts substance users. As mentioned earlier, misinformation can lead to distrust in government and the organizations that hold government accountable, including mainstream news and scientists. We sometimes refer to these organizations as government watchdogs. Here are some examples of that loss of trust. The first example illustrates loss of trust in mainstream news and the government. A 2023 survey found that 66% of Canadians agree that much of the information we receive from news and official government accounts of events can't be trusted. This second example provides an example of possible reasons for these low levels of trust in news sources. A 2021 poll on the public perception of mainstream media indicated that 52% of people polled believe that most news organizations are more concerned with supporting an ideology or political position than with informing the public with factual information. When we lose trust in governments, it becomes more challenging for governments to implement policies to meet our needs. And there is increased public resistance to government policies. An example is initial resistance to the development and implementation of mandatory seatbelt policies that were put in place for our protection. Over time, with increased awareness, using a seatbelt has become an accepted practice by a majority of BC residents. Loss of trust in governments can lead to the spread of misinformation that influences our vote. In Mini Bite 1, we shared an example of disinformation that may have influenced election results in the 2025 federal election in Canada. But disinformation targeting all political parties exists and impacts the results of elections. Many Canadians share concern about the impacts of disinformation on the results of elections. A Ledger poll of over 1,500 Canadians' perceptions of the results of the 2025 federal election indicated that 77% of people polled believe that misinformation had an impact on election results. Only 9% of participants in the poll believed that misinformation had no impact on the election results. For example, Cyabra, a company that monitors discrimination online, analyzed the use of fake profiles by coordinated networks on social media platforms. To identify profiles as fake, Cyabra used software that looked for signs such as synchronized posting, copy-paste campaigns, fake engagement loops, and other behavior resembling bots, including accounts with no personal bios and using default avatars. These profiles targeted the 2025 federal Liberal election campaign and the Liberal Party leader, Mark Carney. Cyabra investigated 2,451 fake profiles that mentioned Carney in February and March. These profiles generated 3,418 posts and comments. 1/3 of the posts were negative, and 76% of the posts connected Mark Carney with Ghislaine Maxwell or Jeffrey Epstein, who were convicted for child sex trafficking. These posts often shared AI-generated images portraying Carney as a, quote, child molesting pervert, end quote. Another way that misinformation harms democracy is by limiting the transparency and accountability of democratic societies. Governments at the municipal, provincial, and federal levels are responsible for making laws and policies that are in our best interests. And we rely on governments to make informed, evidence-based decisions when developing these laws and policies and when evaluating their impacts. But misinformation can influence the decisions made by governments, leading them to make policy decisions that are not evidence-based and not in our best interests, or the best interests of minority groups. One example of the impact of disinformation on transparency and accountability in democratic societies is the government's responses to the toxic drug crisis. unregulated drug toxicity is the leading cause of death in our province for people aged 19 to 59. For the past 10 years, many of BC's leading experts on this topic have provided clear, evidence-based recommendations, which include to increase safe supply and harm reduction programs, and to invest in treatment programs that provide a wide range of options for those in recovery, beyond abstinence-only approaches. Despite this evidence and expert advice, BC's provincial government decided to restrict access to safe supply. Handout 2 includes more information on this topic. Misinformation can also be used by some governments to misrepresent the results of their failed policies. This can lead us to believe that these failed policies were successful. Here's an example of how disinformation can be used to limit accountability when reporting back on failed policies. In his first-year address to Americans, United States President Trump relied on disinformation to make it appear that his economic policies were successful. For example, President Trump stated, "Everyone said, 'Oh, tariffs will cause inflation.' We have no inflation." However, analysis by the PBS News of a wide range of data from Trump's first year in office showed that overall prices are still increasing, although some specific items have declined in price. More information is available in Handout 2.
We're almost at the end of Mini-Bite 3. Let's take a minute to reflect. Can you think of examples of misinformation that impact human rights by promoting divisiveness and polarization, supporting the spread of conspiracy theories, promoting discrimination, hate crimes, and radicalization, limiting our ability to make informed decisions, and harming democracy? Can you identify examples of misinformation that impact human rights in other ways? And finally, what can you do to stop the spread of misinformation to protect human rights? You may wish to pause this recording while you reflect. Handout 3 provides a table with a summary of the human rights impacts. You can write examples of misinformation that demonstrate each human rights impact in this fillable form now or after you've completed this mini-bite. In mini-bites 1, 2, and 3, we explored what misinformation is, why we're concerned about it, the strategies it uses to mislead us, and how it impacts human rights. In mini-bite 4, we will consider what we can all do to stop the spread of misinformation. Thank you for participating in mini-bite 3, Why is Misinformation a Human Rights Issue? If you enjoyed this session, we encourage you to share it with people in your community or organization who may benefit from learning more about misinformation. We also encourage you to download the PDF of this presentation along with the handout package. The handout contains links to sources of information shared in this session, as well as the summary table on the human rights impacts of misinformation. The examples shared in this session may bring up a variety of feelings, especially if they reminded you of similar impacts experienced by either yourself or those you care for. Handout 4 provides some useful supports if you need them.